Thank you, thank you. I have a lot of sort of tangents going through my head after listening to the discussion today, and I remember back a number of years ago when Koof was looking at maybe sharing a space with us at Good Shepherd, and decided not to do that at that time. And as I listened to the discussion and some of the complications, I realized, again, one of the reasons I decided it was time to retire. There's a lot of stuff that I don't have to deal with anymore. But I just had a flash too. I did a wedding a couple of years ago, a couple summers ago, for a local couple here, and it happened to be down in the Detroit area where they were both living and starting their new careers, and they had chosen this beautiful church that was very hard to find. It was out in the middle of nowhere. It was a gorgeous place and a gorgeous view out the window there as you worshiped, and it had a feeling of it was offering a beautiful space for worship, but it wasn't very visible in the community. So I guess if you're going to make that kind of a jump, the point is not just visibility, but inclusion into the community in which you live, and that's hopefully the purpose of a building, is to put you right in the middle of where you need to be. So just another thought. But I also deeply appreciate Carol's words this morning that you shared for our chalice lighting. The human species thinks in metaphors and learns through stories. And that's where we're going today. I've been planning to do this talk for over a month. Tragically, it just happens to be timely. So is there more to the story of the Good Samaritan than being just a good person? We all know how powerful words can be, and some well-known parables. And I apologize for the typo that was in the news, about this talk today. It was not subservice. Some well-known parables are subversive speech through storytelling. And again, the human species thinks in metaphors and learns through stories. That's my hope today. The parables of Jesus have generated a lot of interpretation, and the purpose of this focus this morning on parables is to understand them a little bit better and maybe see them more clearly, at least through a different lens. And let me know if it's helpful, and I'd be happy to pry into another parable or two in the future, like maybe next week. But we should ask some questions about parables. For example, what was the parable or storyteller, the parable teller, trying to say? Who is speaking? And I'm going to be looking at, obviously, the Good Samaritan story. Was that Jesus telling that story, or was Luke telling the story? Or in other parables, was it Matthew? Was it Mark? Was it John? Was it another source? Are they reinterpreting Jesus' words or not? Another question is, who was the storyteller speaking to? It really helps to understand that and what was going on also at the time. What is the context? How does the story fit into what was happening? So we, years and years later, we tend to moralize our interpretations of parables, in part because, well, we assume it's really God who is speaking because, after all, it's in the Bible. And we do it because we live in such different worlds that the details of the story don't often make much sense to us. And so we seek a larger interpretation or meaning because we're so far distant from the parable. So, but first of all, and I'll put up another screenshot here, how would you define parable? And rather than have a long group discussion, here are a couple ways to understand what a parable actually is. It's a story, but it invites participation. Somehow, it's not just a story, it invites you in. It's a story that evokes an answer but may not give one. That's how it sucks you in to try to help you think about what this story means. They're often provocative, they're often surprising and have some kind of an ironic twist. And very important for us this morning, I think, is it is a story that uses ordinary images, things that we would understand if it's a story, for example, about our time. So I would like to look with you this morning at a parable that has survived for 2,000 years because it's a great story. And I would also say it's a story that we know very little about because we don't understand the details of the story. It is the Good Samaritan story from Luke chapter 10. And as you read it on the screen today, this morning, or just listen to it, please pay attention to the material qualities, the details of the parable. And we have it in 3 different sections, and you will see that's intentional, not just so they fit on the screen, but I'll point that out in a little bit. So if you would like to read along with it, you can, or just listen. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And he said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered right. Do this, and you will live." But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion, and went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." Then the story goes on. Which of these 3 do you think proved neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And he said, "The one who showed mercy on him." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Parables start something. They generate a response. They draw you in. So what was the world? What was the context? And I say world with parenthetical, or not with air quotes. What was the world or the context of this parable? And then I would ask you this question. What is your world? What is your context? Does your world interpret this parable in a certain way? And if so, what is it? It might be different from someone else's. So we could read this parable as presented as a whole from verses 25 all the way through 37. That's one option that most people do. It's a story that seems to fit within a Q&A that either Jesus or Luke provides, maybe about what it meant to be a neighbor, perhaps. Well, what does it teach? Is that what Jesus intended, or does Luke change the focus by maybe adding the beginning and the ending? Keep in mind that this story this came from an oral culture, and it was probably written down anywhere from 25 to 70 years later in a form similar to what we now have 2,000 years later. Or we could read it as the story itself, verses 30 to 35. The story itself is about a man going down a road. What might that story itself be about without the Q&A that Luke provides? Who might the audience be is another question that we should ask ourselves. So all that is paying attention to the details and the material qualities of the parable. And I would suggest that if you were alive at the time that this story was originally told, you would likely understand details that we, today's audience, don't understand. Details like Jerusalem. What was Jerusalem? It was the site of the temple. It was the site of the focus of religious authority of the day. It was the home of the powerful and the rich and the famous. It is the seat of religious and political power. Those things were not necessarily separated at that time. In that world, they were one. So Jerusalem is the focus for this massive authority. So man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. What was Jericho? Well, it happened to be the place of Roman authority. It's where Herod's palace was. It's where the elites and the ruling class, I was always taught, go to winter or get away. They were snowbirds, they made this journey away from Jerusalem. So you can kind of factor that in a little bit. And then there's this beginning of this story. It says, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho on the road. Going down on the road. So, what of it? Well, the road descends into the wilderness. Jerusalem is 2,500 feet above sea level. Jericho is 825 feet below sea level. This was a deserted and a dangerous road for people to travel. Well, why? Because there were robbers on the road, right? Okay? What was going on in that time and in that place that would create a situation in which bandits and thieves were targeting and terrorizing people? What was going on? The significance of the road going down is paramount. Well, then a priest comes by. The priests were the highest religious authority of the day. Levites were lay associates of the priests. Why would religious authorities be going to Jericho? Well, that's kind of a complicated thing because priests are retainer figures. They are go-betweens for the status quo of Roman authority as it related to Jewish authority. They were not the same groups of people, okay? And so when not on duty, maybe to relax, maybe to get away, maybe to do some politicking, maybe to take a break from their work. Them, a priest and a Levite in the story, being alone on the road is a problem in the story, in the parable. It doesn't fit reality of the day. If they were traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, they would likely have been in a retinue, especially with robbers around. But hey, this is a story, right? And stories can bend and they can shape details that the storyteller is trying to get across. That's what makes it a good story, okay? That's what makes it a parable. That's how it draws you in. The storyteller is adding a little ironic twist here. We may not get that, but they would have gotten it, right? The hearers, the audience. Then there's this Samaritan. Well, who were Samaritans? Samaritans disputed with Jews over the site of the temple. The northern kingdom is where Jews and Samaritans may have intermingled. The southern kingdom stayed more pure. Jews only. Jerusalem and Jericho are in the southern kingdom. Samaritans, then, in the southern kingdom are foreigners. They are outsiders. And they're often victims of prejudice. Samaritans were not expected to show sympathy to Jews, and Jews were not expected to tolerate or show sympathy to Samaritans. And the audience knows all this. We do not. Details are very revealing, and they lead to a lot of questions. So what do robbers do? Well, they rob, right? What do they rob to get money. Well, why do they need to get money? Because they don't have any, perhaps? Maybe to live? Well, why was that necessary? Many forms of violence are created when there is pressure in society. Gangs appear, random violence, executions of people for political reasons were happening all the time. Poverty, social inequalities, terrorism, border disputes that turn violent. Violence is a symptom of the social fabric of a society. And in this case, social banditry, robbers, is a symptom. So what was going on in the world? And then we can ask ourselves, well, what's going on in our world? How might this story be relevant in our own time? Violence is often focused in the wrong place. Victims are often innocent. And the negative energy, one could argue, should be directed at the source or the cause of the problem, not at innocent people. So now you may recognize this parable perhaps as a picture or a codification of violence directed horizontally, horizontal violence, or even the redistribution of wealth. So we could ask ourselves questions like, well, who has the wealth and the power at that time? Well, the ruling class did. Foreigners and outsiders and insiders who had worked their way into positions of authority. Well, who is the victim in this story? For example, I think there are more than one, but who is the primary victim? Who does not have an identity in the story? Everybody has an identity in the story except for the man. The man was going down. A man was going down. A generic, nameless person is the victim. Whoever is in the way is a victim. But not the powerful, not the elite who pass by unscathed. The powerful and the elite will turn it around and then blame someone. Who would they blame? Well, you could blame the victim. You could blame the bandits. And you can hear the audience murmuring, well, he shouldn't have been about the victim. He shouldn't have been on that road. What did he think was going to happen being on that road? Because they knew about the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. But the people who are often the victims are already people like the robbers, I would suggest, who did not have money or status or power or control over their lives. So what function, think about it, what function does blaming the victim serve in that world or in ours? Well, it maintains a status quo. It keeps the power where it is. You can hear people saying, well, just look at what they do to themselves. They attack each other. They need us to help them with their lives. Part of what makes this, I think, a good story are some of these little details and dynamics. Victims are often blamed in poverty situations. They are blamed in border disputes. They are blamed in rape and abuse cases. They are blamed in dysfunctional family systems. We blame young people who commit violence or suicide. And though the details in our world are different than the details of this story, this is still a true story. Tragically, as we see today in Gaza. And it presents a very complicated problem, then and now. So if you or we were going to address the underlying issues of our world or do a critique of that world, where would you start? Where would we start to address the underlying issues that cause violence? Well, hopefully we would ask a lot of questions. Like, for example, who's in control? Who has power? And how did they get it? In this parable, the true and absolute authority is Rome. It's not the temple. How did Rome, for example, stay in control? How do people in our world stay in control? Well, one way is by dividing and conquering. Time-tested method. You pit the victims against each other, like Jews and Samaritans, like Sunnis and Shiites, like any people of color. Pit them against each other, like the right versus the left, Republicans versus Democrats. Different categories of poor people, divide them against each other. How about Jews and Palestinians? Divide them against each other. If they disable and they kill each other, then the people in power can come out ahead. And in the specific time this story was told, Rome also needed the religious authorities to help them stay in control. So in a way, it is a shared authority. We'll help you if you help us. But if there's a real question about who is in control, we will bury you. So, for example, in that world, Rome ended up destroying the Jerusalem temple in the year 70, and then Masada fell in 74, which was 40 years after Jesus may have told this story, and certainly a number of years after Luke told it. So where do we start? I mean, that's part of the problem today, is understanding how to even begin. So two ways occur to me. One is to unite the victims, unite the powerless, unite the poor. And another way is to continue to call out the powers that victimize innocent people, no matter who they are. Well, we miss a lot of the significance of this story because, frankly, Jerusalem and Jericho and priests and Levites and Samaritans are not our world. But if you were in the audience when Jesus told this story, you would be drawn in. And so what I would like to do is add some sound effects, and you can add some too if you like, as reaction to the telling of this parable, okay? So this was not a lecture here, probably. There were people in the crowd that would have been responding. So Jesus says, a man was going down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. What? What's he doing that for? It's not a good idea. He's going to get whacked, you know. Robbers. Oh, boo. Robbers, scum. Or, hey, if that guy is that dumb, he deserves to get robbed, right? Robbers probably had a little bit of a mixed, some approved and some didn't approve. And a priest, of course, passes by. Well, he's not going to help. We'd maybe assume that he would, but no, he's not going to help. He can't get his hands dirty. He needs to stay ritually clean. We can't, and then others might say, well, you know, well, we can't blame a priest. That's not our world. That was their world, maybe. We can't blame a priest. Most wouldn't dare to rob or criticize a priest, because though they are in cahoots with Rome, they're still priests. You know, we do not criticize religion, and so the audience might not see how the priests and the religious authorities and religion itself was participating in the violence that was directed horizontally against them. But a Samaritan came along. Well, what might the response of the audience have been to that? Well, he's not going to help. Or what is he doing here anyway? Go back to your own country. In fact, they might be ready to do to the Samaritan what was done to the man. Beat the hell out of him or her. Now ask yourself, why would Jesus tell this particular story? You have to know what was going on. Maybe to wake people up. Maybe to unite them. Maybe to expose the systems that were oppressing and killing them. So is there a significance to this story besides the moral implications that we have given it for 2,000 years? Is there a significance to the story besides be good to your neighbor? Offensive as it is, a Samaritan can, in fact, be a good neighbor to a Jew. And people in power, even when they are one of us, often choose to defend their vested interests rather than caring for someone who's laying on the side of the road, beaten and in need. And maybe this Samaritan responds the way that he did because he knows what it's like to be a victim on the side of the road. Well, a story can make us awfully uncomfortable. And we may decide to shoot the messenger so we don't have to hear the message. Or we may choose to protect our own without recognizing that violence does not happen in a vacuum. So who are the victims in this story? Obviously the man, just an ordinary person. And he is all of us. He is each of us. You could argue, too, that the robbers are victims of a system that robs them of their ability to take care of themselves and their families and their world. So can you see this robber as a human being and not just a bad person? And that's really hard to separate an act of violence, like robbing someone in this story, from the person doing the robbing. It's no way it's not a justification of what happens, but it's maybe there. The victim is also the Samaritan. If one begins to know them as human beings, the real causes and issues then that divides Jews and Samaritans could be addressed. The Samaritans of our world are usually innocent, and they are often victims. Yet they are who we currently blame and treat as less than human. And they become targets. And from a Hebrew Scripture perspective, perhaps they are the last and the least and the lost and the little ones that God seems to care for. When Jesus says, when the man quotes Scripture saying, love your neighbor as yourself. So in reality, however, no Samaritan would be there at all, especially not alone. And remember, this is a story. The storyteller can put a Samaritan there if the storyteller wants to do that. The story then draws the audience in. Well, why wouldn't a Samaritan be there? And can a Samaritan do good? These are little ironic, subtle, in-your-face kind of twists in the story that are more obvious to the original audience than they are to us. So how do we today hear these details? We don't want to hear who the Samaritans of today are any more than the original audience did. But my question is this more than a nice story with a nice little moral? And I would suggest, and you can put on that next screenshot, that in telling this story, Jesus was not a nice person as he told this in-your-face story that has potentially painful realizations that would be very obvious to his world. And hopefully today they are to ours as well. Awakenings, realizations like, if Jews can consider Samaritans to be good, this world can begin to change. If Samaritans can consider Jews to be good, this world can begin to change. And if not good, at least neighbors. Another painful realization is that religion has caused us to be enemies. That's just shameful. Another realization might be that power always conquers and divides, and innocent people get hurt. And a final one might be this: we should have a problem when politics and religion oppress people. So who are the Samaritans in our world today? Who are victims in today's world and why? And the list could go on and on and on. Who are the powerful? The next The last screenshot today is, who are the powerful who conquer and divide? But the victims, can you say, who are the victims of today? Can you say Palestinian? Can you say Jew? Can you say Venezuelan? Or immigrant, or poor person, or trans person, working class people? You fill out the details on your own. Who are the powerful then who conquer and divide? Is an ongoing question. So I would suggest this morning that this parable has no single teaching. It has no single meaning. It does not give some simple moralistic answer about how bad I am and how good God is. This story draws you in, and it will generate a response. Just like what's happening today will generate a response. Some will cheer, some will boo. People will walk out, people will turn away from you, or people will just continue to choose sides and declare themselves innocent and the other side guilty. But maybe a story like this can help us understand that by marginalizing categories of people, we perpetuate the dis-ease in which we live. Stories can help us understand what will actually change our lives. And just to give you one final little thing to think about, and perhaps it's more relevant to Christians who have tried to figure out for centuries how Jesus saves. If this is one way to interpret this parable, just why was Jesus executed? Might telling a story like this have added him to the category of messengers who need to be shot? And what is redeeming about that? How can any death? This is an open question. I'm not looking for one specific answer. This is a parable in itself. How can a death be redeeming? How might it actually save us? It's an open question. Thank you. And I'll go back.